So in Jane Austen's Persuasion, the main character is called Anne Elliot, and she just loves her ancestral home at Kellynch. She wishes that she could just live there forever. But at the end of the book, she marries this guy named Captain Wentworth. And here is where an interesting question comes up. Does Captain Wentworth buy Kellynch for his wife? Did he give Anne her ancestral home as their wedding present? That is an interesting question that has been raised by the movie version of Persuasion put out in 2007, and it's one of the most Googled questions about Captain Wentworth of whether he bought Kellynch or not. So today we're going to be answering this question, and we're going to be delving into important concepts behind inheritance in the Regency era to understand exactly why Captain Wentworth bought Kellynch or didn't buy Kellynch. Yeah. Anyway, my name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about classic literature and history. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So, does Captain Wentworth actually buy Kellynch at the end of Persuasion? The answer is no, he does not. That is not in the book. But more importantly, legally, he could not have bought Kellynch. And also traditionally, it would have been unlikely for him to have been able to anyway. But why? Well, the answer to that has to do with how land and wealth and estates were passed down through families in this era. It all goes back to this concept of primogeniture. And this concept actually underlies a lot of Jane Austen's books. In fact, it explains why Captain Wentworth can't buy Kellynch, why Mr. Collins is going to inherit Longbourn in Pride and Prejudice, and also why the Dashwood sisters in Sense and Sensibility get left out in the cold when their uncle dies in chapter 1 of Sense and Sensibility. So in this video, we're going to be going into the concept of primogeniture, or that big why behind the way families behaved. And in a different video, I'm going to go into entails and pretty much the legal how they made it happen. So today we're going into why. In a different video, we'll go into how. But let's answer this question of why estates were left the way they were. Okay, so what is primogeniture? Basically, it's this concept that the bulk of a family's wealth, land, and estates should be kept together. So it should not be subdivided up, and it should also pass to one person. And that's how it won't be subdivided. If only one person inherits it, it's not being subdivided among like 5 kids. And then the next one person inherits it, and then the next one person inherits it. And usually that one person was male, basically the oldest son of a family. So here we have that concept of the oldest son inheriting almost everything. And then his son would inherit, and his son would inherit. If the oldest son died without children, the next oldest son would get it. If that guy died, the next oldest son would get it. If they have no more brothers, their cousin's gonna get it. If he dies, his cousin's gonna get it. Basically, it's going to go down the male line. So while obviously the bulk of the family's wealth is being passed down this way, of course the daughters and the younger sons would be given a portion of the family's fortune, but it would be relatively small compared to the major bulk that's going to go to the oldest son there. So for example, when we're talking about daughters' portions or fortunes, usually it's that dowry that we've talked about before in videos like why are the Bennet sisters so poor? So basically, while the sisters do get a small little amount of money, and obviously the younger brothers also usually got a small amount of money that would help them get started in something like the military or the church as a career, that oldest son was going to inherit the bulk of the estates and the money. That's the basic concept of primogeniture. Anyway, we see a perfect example of this happening in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, where the oldest son is set to inherit the estate and all that money that goes with it. Meanwhile, the younger son of Edmund has been helped by his family financially to go into the church. Meanwhile, the sisters have their own small portions or dowries that helps them hopefully catch husbands. And we see the same thing happening in Northanger Abbey, where Captain Tilney is set to inherit Northanger Abbey. Meanwhile, his younger brother Henry has been helped to go into the church. So in both of these families, we see this concept of primogeniture working. Now let's talk about exactly why families would do this, because at first it seems very unfair fair to our modern sensibilities, right? Why does one kid get the majority of the money where all the other kids get like not that much comparatively? Like, this doesn't seem fair. So basically, primogeniture was a strategic social, wealth, and political move by families, and here's why they would do it. So first up, power. Like I talk about in my video on what is the aristocracy, land ownership equals power, as in political power. Male landowners were the only ones who could vote during this time. They were also the only ones who could be elected to the House of Commons. And this is exactly why families did not want their land assets to be broken up equally among their children. Because after a few generations, instead of them owning a lot of land, their kids would only own some land, their grandkids would only own a little bit of land, their great-grandkids would like barely have anything. They'd be probably selling it off and losing the land altogether. But by having this land ownership maintained, the family maintained some political power. And in fact, as the 1800s went through different sort of reforms, one of the things non-land owning classes constantly tried to reform was this concept of primogeniture and the legal hows that go with it. And by trying to outlaw the legal means of primogeniture, what reformers were actually doing was attacking the landed classes' political power. Because if they could get these families to have to legally break up their landed estates instead of passing them intact along the male line, they would be breaking up their ability to rule. So those bills were constantly fought against by the landed classes because they recognized keeping their estates intact meant keeping their political power intact. So that is the first reason that these families wanted to maintain that concentrated wealth and land in one person's hands. The second one is wealth. So we've talked a lot before on this channel about how land produced money, for example, in the videos on Mr. Darcy's money, whether he's so rich or not. But basically, land equaled money. It was stable and substantial compared to other sources of income at the time. So I think before, we've had in the comments like, oh, what sort of family would you want to be in during this era? And of course, wanting to be in the merchant class has come up a lot in the comments. But here's an important thing to remember if you do want to be in the merchant class in the Regency era, which is it was incredibly unstable. So for example, 4 out of 5 manufacturers in Manchester during this era failed. 4 out of 5, that's like 80% failure rate. And this was an era where you could get thrown in jail for debt. Meanwhile, merchants like Mr. Gardiner in Pride and Prejudice usually had to run their businesses based off of incredibly shaky credit systems that led to a lot of economic instability, had a high suicide rate because things were that stressful and unstable for them. Meanwhile, in the landed gentry, they owned land. Even if a crop failed for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, they knew it was going to eventually come back. Land was stable, it was substantial, and it was seen as the gold standard of wealth. So this is another reason that those families wanted to keep a hold of their land, and they wanted to keep it intact as much as possible. The third factor is, of course, social standing. Landowners were very high on the social scale, and of course, the more land you owned, the better. Because again, it gave you more political power, it gave you more money, it gave you more social standing. So wanting to maintain this land intact was maintaining your family's social standing. So, and while we're talking about social standing, like I talk about in my video of is your culture like the Regency era, we learned that the Regency is a collective group culture where they do value the group over the individual. And I think this is a perfect example of how that works. So with their group culture, what they're doing is they're valuing the entire family as a group's social standing versus the individual members. So with this group thinking about the family, basically, even though the wealth is concentrated in the oldest son's hands, his increased social standing because of that brings up the entire family group. So the entire family group's social standing and connections is improved by maintaining that oldest son. And it really was the oldest son's responsibility to help his younger siblings, if they were sisters, make good matches, and also to help his brothers advance in their careers. So it's important to remember that even though legally a lot of the wealth was supposed to go to the oldest son, he was supposed to use that within this group thinking to help all of his family and siblings. So that is the basic concept of primogeniture, and we do see it consistently happening throughout Jane Austen's books. But of course, I feel like we tend to notice primogeniture the most in Jane Austen's books when we have a family where something's going a little bit wrong with it. For example, the fact that Mr. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice has no sons, or Sir Walter in Persuasion has no sons. So the family was still very attached to this idea of primogeniture, and they wanted to maintain the family's status and honor as a group, even if that meant passing the wealth along to a more distant relative. For example, Mr. Collins or Anne Elliot's cousin, Mr. Elliot, in Persuasion. And we see this from this quote in Persuasion, which I think is very interesting, where Sir Walter's thinking about the fact that even if he could sell Kellynch to somebody else, he wouldn't. It says, he had condescended to mortgage as far as he had the power, but he would never condescend to sell. No, he would never disgrace his name so far that Kellynch estate should be transmitted whole and entire as he had received it. So here we see Sir Walter thinking about the fact that even if he had the power to sell Kellynch, he wouldn't have, because his and his whole family's honor is riding on the fact that he needs to transmit this bulk of wealth and land to the next family head, which was going to be Mr. Elliot. And of course, there are legal protections in play too, happening in Persuasion, which I'm going to talk about in that other video on the how this actually legally worked. But basically, even if those legal protections were not there, Sir Walter would have still adhered to the rules of primogeniture. And we have the same thing happening in Pride and Prejudice. The legal how has been put in place to make the rules of primogeniture happen and make Mr. Collins inherit. Which I just want to have a quick answer to a question you guys have been asking, which is, if Mr. Collins is the next in the male Bennet family line, why isn't his last name Bennet? Why is it Collins? Now, the book doesn't actually tell us the answer to this, but men did change their last names in Jane Austen's era. I do talk about this a little bit more in my video on why Mr. Darcy isn't a lord, but basically men were willing to change their family's last name in order to inherit money from someone, or if they were going to marry an heiress, and it was a stipulation of her inheritance, and so men did change their last names. So more than likely, either Mr. Bennet or Mr. Collins at some point to inherit some money has had their last name changed, either themselves or one of their ancestors. And that's how they can be of the same male line but have different last names. Summing all of those up, in the Regency era, owning a lot of land in estates was important socially, politically, and money-wise. And they wanted to maintain the entire group family's social standing by keeping all of it intact by passing it down to one person in the male line. And that was the concept of primogeniture, and why Captain Wentworth can't buy Kellynch, because Mr. Elliot's gonna inherit it, and why Mr. Collins is inheriting Longbourn. Yeah. Anyway, again, I'm going to be making a video on how legally this actually came about, because while primogeniture is a great idea to understand, the families at the time actually used legal methods to make sure that their descendants actually followed it. Because you never know when a descendant's going to go suddenly rogue and be like, you know what? I'm leaving my land to this random person over here. Or for example, like I talk about in my video on Jane Austen's time at a boarding school, there was an uncle that left his money to a servant. I'm saying scandal sometimes went down in the Regency era. You didn't have the legal protections of entails and stuff. So yeah. Anyway, let me know in the comments below if you lived during this era. Would you be okay with primogeniture? Like if you were a daughter and your older brother was set to inherit pretty much everything, would you be okay with that? Or would you be like, I want an equal share? Let me know down below. My name is Ellie Dashwood and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe and keep being awesome because you're awesome. Bye!